In the quiet town of Cedar Ridge, California, a seemingly ordinary burial ceremony takes a tragic turn. As the townspeople mourn the loss of a beloved local historian, a lone wolf emerges from the woods and begins to dig up the freshly covered grave. What the animal uncovers is a terrifying secret that will forever change the lives of the residents. On a quiet and somber evening in Cedar Ridge, California, the small, tight-knit community gathered under the fading light of dusk to bid their final goodbyes to Rebecca Thornton. The air hung heavy with grief, as she had been more than just a beloved local historian. She was the town's storyteller, the keeper of its past, and a cherished figure who always had time for others. Her knowledge of Cedar Ridge was vast, and her dedication to preserving its history was something that would be remembered for generations. Her sudden illness had taken everyone by surprise. Despite the efforts of doctors and the prayers of those around her, Rebecca had succumbed to the sickness after only a few months, leaving a void in the hearts of all who knew her. The townspeople stood in a semicircle around the freshly dug grave, their faces etched with sorrow as the chill of the evening air crept in, adding a tangible weight to their grief. Heads bowed, hands clasped, they watched silently as the coffin was lowered into the earth. The ceremony was simple, befitting Rebecca's own quiet grace, yet the collective mourning of the community was palpable. As the final words were spoken, something unexpected happened. A rustling noise, faint but distinct, came from the nearby woods. At first, no one paid it much mind, the sound blending with the evening breeze that stirred the trees. But when the rustling grew louder, heads turned, and the mourners exchanged puzzled glances. Then, out of the shadows, a large, solitary wolf emerged from the forest. The sight of the creature sent a ripple of unease through the gathered crowd. Wolves were not uncommon in the area, but for one to approach so boldly and during such a solemn moment was deeply unsettling. The wolf was no ordinary animal. Its eyes, gleaming in the dim light, seemed almost to reflect something more than just animal instinct. It padded toward the grave with slow, deliberate steps, ignoring the murmurs of the townspeople and their increasingly frantic attempts to scare it away. The wolf was focused on something, and its gaze never wavered from the freshly covered grave of Rebecca Thornton. Whispers spread through the crowd. Some people took a few hesitant steps backward. Others remained frozen in place, caught between fear and curiosity. The wolf, undeterred by the presence of humans, moved closer to the grave. Someone shouted, and a few others joined in, hoping to drive the creature away, but the wolf only responded with a low, guttural growl that silenced the attempts. Then, without warning, the tranquil mood of the evening shattered into chaos. The townsfolk, their initial apprehension turning into panic, scattered in all directions. They ran, stumbled, and tripped over uneven ground, their footsteps loud against the stillness of the cemetery. But the wolf didn't react to the fleeing humans. Its focus remained on the grave. The wolf began to dig, its strong paws tearing into the soft earth that had just been laid to rest over the coffin. Its movements were purposeful, as if it knew exactly what it was searching for. A sense of dread settled over those who stayed behind, watching the unsettling scene unfold. The wolf, a wild predator, was desecrating the final resting place of someone they had all loved and respected, but no one dared to intervene. As it dug deeper, the wolf reached the top of the coffin, its claws scraping against the wood. The sound sent a chill through the onlookers. The creature sniffed the surface of the coffin, its nose twitching as it followed a scent that seemed to guide its every movement. What could it possibly be looking for? The question hung in the minds of the townspeople, each of them too stunned to speak. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf paused. It had uncovered something. A small, weathered leather book nestled in the soil beside the coffin. The wolf sniffed the book, its interest piqued for a moment. But as soon as it realized that the scent was not that of prey, it let out a brief snarl and turned away, retreating back into the shadows of the forest from which it had come. The silence that followed was deafening. Slowly, cautiously, the townsfolk approached the grave once more. Rebecca's closest friend, Sarah, stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. With trembling hands, she reached for the small leather book, now partially unearthed by the wolf. It felt strange to the touch, as though it had been in the ground for much longer than it should have been. How had it gotten there? Who had placed it in the soil before the ceremony? These were questions Sarah couldn't begin to answer. The townspeople gathered around her, their curiosity mingling with fear. As Sarah opened the book, her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. It was Rebecca's. But why hadn't she mentioned this book before? Rebecca had given Sarah some personal belongings before her passing, things she had specifically requested be kept safe, but there had been no mention of a diary. The townsfolk exchanged confused glances as Sarah slowly turned the pages. The entries were filled with more than just historical notes. They were deeply personal reflections from Rebecca. She had poured her heart into the pages, documenting her thoughts, fears, and most disturbingly, a dark secret she had uncovered in the months before her illness. According to the diary, Cedar Ridge was not the idyllic town everyone thought it to be. Rebecca had discovered a secret network of poachers and animal traffickers operating in the shadows, led by two of the most prominent families in town. These families, who had always been viewed as pillars of the community, were deeply involved in the illegal trade of wildlife, smuggling animals across borders and profiting from the destruction of the local ecosystem. Worse still, their ties extended beyond the town, connecting them to dangerous individuals in Mexico who were part of a larger syndicate. Rebecca's meticulous research had led her to the truth, but it had also placed her in danger. The more she uncovered, the more she realized the lengths these families would go to protect their secret. Threats had been made against her, subtle at first, but they had grown more menacing as time went on. Rebecca had written about strange cars following her, late-night phone calls where no one spoke, and anonymous letters left at her door, warning her to stay silent. The realization of what Rebecca had been going through hit Sarah like a wave. She had no idea that her friend had been living in such fear, carrying the burden of this knowledge alone. As Sarah continued to read, tears welled up in her eyes. Rebecca had planned to expose the families, to bring their crimes to light, but her illness had taken her before she could finish what she had started. The entries in the diary grew more frantic in the final weeks before Rebecca's death. She wrote about feeling watched, about sensing that time was running out. She had hidden the diary, knowing that it was the only evidence she had, but she didn't trust anyone in the town to protect it. Sarah's heart ached as she read the final pages, where Rebecca expressed her hope that if anything happened to her, someone would find the diary and continue her work. Sarah wiped her tears, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just read. The families involved were powerful, their influence reaching deep into the town's government and law enforcement. But she couldn't let that stop her. Rebecca had sacrificed too much, and the truth needed to come out. That night, Sarah barely slept. The weight of the diary and the responsibility it carried kept her awake. By morning, she had made up her mind. She couldn't do this alone. She needed help, someone she could trust. The first person who came to mind was Jake, a local police detective who had known Rebecca and had always been a man of integrity. If anyone could help her, it was him. Sarah contacted Jake, and within hours, he arrived at her home. His face was grim as she recounted the contents of the diary, detailing the web of corruption and illegal activity that Rebecca had uncovered. Jake listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word. When Sarah finished, he let out a long breath, clearly troubled by what he had heard. "This is bigger than I thought," Jake muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We've suspected something like this for a while, but without concrete evidence, there was nothing we could do." Sarah handed him the diary, her fingers trembling slightly. "This is the evidence. It's all here. We can't let them get away with this." Jake nodded, flipping through the pages. "You're right. But we have to be careful. These people are dangerous, and they won't hesitate to protect themselves, no matter the cost." Over the next few days, Jake and Sarah worked together to piece together a plan. Jake assembled a small team of trusted officers, those who hadn't been compromised by the influence of the powerful families. They worked in secret, knowing that if word got out about their investigation, it could all come crashing down. They couldn't afford any mistakes. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. Rebecca's research had only scratched the surface of the syndicate's operations. The poaching and trafficking extended far beyond Cedar Ridge into neighboring towns and across state lines. The animals that had been disappearing from the nearby forests were being sold to collectors and traders in distant markets. The syndicate's reach was vast, and its members were ruthless. As they gathered more evidence, the danger became increasingly apparent. Jake received anonymous threats, and Sarah's home was broken into twice, though nothing was taken. It was clear that the families were aware that something was happening, and they were determined to stop it. Despite the mounting pressure, Sarah refused to back down. She couldn't let Rebecca's death be in vain, but the stress was taking its toll. She barely slept, and the constant fear of retaliation loomed over her like a dark cloud. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more often, her heart racing at the slightest sound outside her window. Jake, too, was feeling the strain. His investigation had grown too big to keep under wraps for much longer, and he knew they needed to act soon. But they couldn't rely on local law enforcement. Too many people were compromised. They needed federal involvement, someone with the power to take down the syndicate once and for all. One evening, after another long day of digging through evidence, Jake and Sarah made the decision to contact the FBI. It was a risk, but they had no other choice. If the syndicate caught wind of their plans, it could all be over in an instant. Jake made the call, and within days, federal agents were quietly brought in to assess the situation. The agents were stunned by the scope of the operation, and they agreed that a joint task force would be necessary to take down the trafficking ring. But they also made it clear that the operation would need to be executed with precision. One wrong move, and the entire syndicate could vanish into thin air. For weeks, Jake, Sarah, and the federal agents worked in secret, preparing for the day they would finally bring the syndicate to justice. Isn't that amazing? Who would have guessed that a simple act by a hungry wolf could cause such a big change? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and be sure to check back for more exciting stories.